You look at a map of the world, and there's just this inherent expectation of order.
Right, it looks like math. It's geometry.
Exactly. You see these solid, color-coded countries with those crisp, definitive black lines separating them. And it feels, well, it feels permanent.
It really implies that some rational architect carefully constructed the world that way.
Yeah, but today we're going to look a little closer at how one of those lines was actually drawn. And when you do that, the comforting geometry just completely falls apart.
Because you realize you aren't looking at a carefully constructed floor plan.
No, not at all. You are looking at the diagnostic X-ray of a societal fracture. Like you're literally looking at a scar.
And it's the physical manifestation of a massive systemic failure, a moment in history where attempting to map out a solution didn't create order. It triggered one of the most violent, chaotic human catastrophes in recorded history.
Which brings us to the core of today's deep dive. We have an incredible stack of notes provided directly by you, the listener.
And they are fantastic notes.
They really are. We know you are someone who actively avoids surface-level summaries. You want the mechanics. You want to understand the invisible levers that move history.
And the material you brought us on the 1947 Partition of India does exactly that.
Right, because we are not just going to recite a timeline of how British India was divided into two independent nations, a Hindu-majority India and a Muslim homeland in Pakistan.
No, we are going to deconstruct the exact step-by-step mechanics of how a functioning society of hundreds of millions of people descended into absolute survival mode in a matter of weeks.
And more than that, we are going to explore a deeply personal framework you introduced, this sub-personality lens called MAC, which helps us understand how geopolitical collapse actively weaponizes human identity.
Yeah, that psychological lens is what makes this analysis so singular. It's fascinating.
It really is. It forces us to look at macro-level imperial decisions and immediately ask, well, how does this dictate the emotional and physical survival of an individual on the ground?
Exactly. Like, how do you adapt when your entire society forces you to reduce your complex identity into a single, rigid box?
Okay, so to understand how a collapse of this magnitude happens, you have to look at the architecture of the society before it fell.
Right, you need the baseline.
Exactly. So let's examine the baseline of British India in the early 20th century, because at a glance, the system looked incredibly stable.
Oh, absolutely. You had an immense administrative apparatus.
Yeah, after 1858, the British Crown had consolidated power, operating through a viceroy, and they were backed by this massive colonial bureaucracy and a unified military.
He was a masterclass in administrative control, honestly. But it was highly deceptive.
How so?
Well, the top layer was intensely centralized in the hands of the British. But underneath, the subcontinent was a total patchwork.
Right, because you had the directly ruled provinces, but then you also had, over 500 princely states?
Yeah, places like Hyderabad, Kashmir, Mysore.
Yeah.
These states were ruled by local maharajas and nawabs who had a degree of domestic autonomy.
As long as they recognized British paramountcy.
Exactly. So it created this illusion of deep structural stability because the administrative shell was so robust. They had a codified legal system, immense taxation infrastructure.
And the bureaucracy functioned like a machine.
It did. But the load-bearing walls of that machine were fundamentally compromised.
Let's look at the economic pillar of that, because that's huge. You've got an agrarian powerhouse deeply integrated into global trade.
Right. Exporting cotton, jute, tea.
Yeah, so on paper, it's highly productive. But I want to introduce an analogy here to explain the mechanics of what was actually happening.
How for it?
Instead of looking at the economy like a thriving, diverse garden, you have to look at it as a monoculture forest.
Oh, I like that.
Right, because it is heavily engineered to produce one specific type of yield for the sole benefit of an external harvester.
That is the perfect systemic analogy. The British colonial economy in India wasn't designed to build internal resilience.
Yep.
It was explicitly extractive.
Yeah, let's talk about the mechanics of that deindustrialization. Because before British rule, India was one of the world's largest producers of finished textiles.
They were massive. But the British didn't want to compete with Indian weavers.
So what did they do?
They imposed massive tariffs on Indian finished goods entering Britain, while simultaneously flooding the Indian market with cheap, factory-made textiles from Manchester.
Wow, so they systematically dismantled the local industrial base.
Exactly, forcing the population almost entirely into agriculture. They turned a highly diversified economy into a massive plantation designed to feed British factories with raw materials.
And this is where I want to push back on the standard narrative of colonial progress, specifically regarding infrastructure.
For railways, right?
Yeah, because you often hear, well, the British built the fourth largest railway network in the world. They laid telegraph lines. They built deep water ports.
Right. The look at all we built for you argument.
Exactly. People say, surely that is a net positive for a developing nation. But if we stick to the monoculture forest analogy, those railways aren't there to help the ecosystem.
Not at all. Look at the actual geographical layout of the colonial railways.
They weren't built to connect major Indian internal markets to one another, were they?
No, not to foster domestic trade. They were built like spokes on a wheel, connecting the rich agricultural interiors straight to the major export ports.
Like Bombay, Calcutta, Madras.
Yeah, it was a massive conveyor belt for extraction. And militarily, the railways allowed British troops to be deployed rapidly across the subcontinent to crush dissent.
So the infrastructure was incredibly strong, but its purpose was control and extraction, not the nourishment of the society it sat upon.
Exactly. So if a shock hits that economic system, say a drought or a global war, the local population has absolutely no economic resilience.
They have no safety net because all the surplus wealth has been siphoned off.
Which is exactly how you end up with devastating events like the famines that periodically ravaged the subcontinent under British rule.
Because the system produced enough wealth and food, but the distribution mechanisms were entirely unconcerned with local survival.
Right. It was enforced order, not organic unity.
Which brings us to the social and cultural pillars. Because despite this extractive overhead, the everyday society on the ground, the Hindus, Muslims, Sikhs, Christians, Parsis, they had coexisted for centuries.
Yeah, and this is where your notes introduce this brilliant concept of layered identity.
Which is deeply tied to that Max subpersonality lens we're going to explore later.
Right. Before the mid-19th century, if you asked someone who they were, they didn't just give you a binary religious label.
Identity was incredibly fluid, wasn't it? Highly contextual.
Exactly. A person's identity was like a stack of overlapping circles. A farmer in Bengal might identify first by his regional language, Bengali.
And he might share syncretic cultural traditions, local festivals, and a shared socioeconomic class with his Hindu neighbor.
Yeah, the fact that he was Muslim and his neighbor was Hindu was just one layer of a very thick social fabric.
They were deeply intertwined through shared commerce, shared geography, and shared local history.
But the architecture of the state couldn't handle that fluidity.
Right, because the British administrative machine needed to categorize people to govern them efficiently.
And this is the first real systemic fracture, the British census of 1881.
The census, it seems so mundane, but it's huge.
The census is a vital piece of the mechanics of this collapse. When the British conducted the census, they didn't have a methodology for layered, overlapping identities.
Their administrative logic was entirely Victorian and binary.
Right. The census enumerators went around asking people, what is your religion? And they forced millions of people with fluid, syncretic beliefs to tick a single, rigid box.
You had to legally define yourself as just Hindu or just Muslim or just Sikh.
Yeah. It's the bureaucratic equivalent of an XACTO knife.
Oh, that's a good way to put it. It doesn't cause immediate bloodshed, but it neatly slices the population into mutually exclusive categories.
Exactly. It takes the MAC identity, the person who thrives in the intersections, and says, the state does not recognize your complexity. Pick a side.
And once the state categorizes you by religion, it starts allocating resources based on that, right?
Yep. Government jobs and eventually political representation, all based on those exact religious categories. They institutionalize the divisions.
And that transitions us from the baseline illusion of stability directly into the slow, creeping strain that preceded the collapse.
The pre-collapse strain.
Right. Let's track that shift in the societal temperature. We are moving out of the latent strain and into active escalation.
And then you have the All India Muslim League, led by Muhammad Ali Jinnah, advocating for a separate Muslim state, Pakistan.
And it is absolutely critical here to impartially examine the mechanics of why the Muslim League took that stance.
Right, because it wasn't born out of a vacuum. By the 1930s, the British had introduced a system of separate electorates.
Meaning what, exactly?
This meant that Muslim voters could only vote for Muslim candidates and Hindu voters for Hindu candidates.
Oh, wait, really? They actually hardwired religious segregation into the democratic process itself?
Yes, they tied political survival entirely to religious identity.
Wow.
So as independence became a real possibility, the Muslim League looked at the demographics. Muslims made up roughly 25% of the subcontinent.
Okay, so in a unified, one-person, one-vote democratic system without those British protections.
The Muslim League harbored a deep existential fear that they would be permanently outvoted and politically marginalized by the Hindu majority.
So their push for Pakistan was, in their view, a necessary mechanism for political self-preservation and self-determination.
Exactly.
But here's where the collision happens. The Congress Party genuinely believed that dividing the country based on religion was a catastrophic mistake that would destroy the secular fabric of the subcontinent.
Right. Neither vision was inherently malicious, but they were fundamentally, structurally incompatible plans for the future.
You cannot build a unified nation and partition it at the exact same time. The political leaders are deadlocked.
And while the top is deadlocked, what is happening at the foundation?
World War II happens.
Oh man, yeah. The economic strain of the Second World War cannot be overstated.
Not at all. The British diverted massive amounts of Indian resources, food, and industrial output to the war effort.
And the subcontinent experienced hyperinflation,
Yep.
right? The cost of basic necessities just skyrocketed.
Yeah, post-WWII, inflation and food shortages made people desperate.
And when we talk about mechanisms of collapse, economic desperation fundamentally rewires human psychology.
It really does. When a population is well-fed and financially secure, extreme political rhetoric usually bounces off them. But when people can't afford grain, when their children are hungry, their tolerance for nuance completely evaporates.
They become terrified.
Yeah.
And terrified people are incredibly easy to mobilize.
They are looking for someone to blame.
And because the political architecture had already segregated them into religious camps, it was incredibly easy for local politicians to point across the aisle and say, they are the reason you are starving. They are going to take whatever you have left.
Right. This brings me to a major question about the infrastructure. We talked about the railways and the telegraphs.
Yeah.
My modern inclination is to think that communication technology is a tool of enlightenment. Like, if a false rumor starts about one community attacking another, doesn't the telegraph allow the government or journalists to instantly broadcast the truth and calm everyone down?
You'd think so, wouldn't you?
Yeah. Why didn't the infrastructure act as a pressure valve?
Well, in a high-trust society, technology does act as a pressure valve. But remember the monoculture forest analogy.
Right.
By the mid-1940s, public trust in the British government and in the opposing political parties was practically zero.
So the infrastructure simply scales the reality of the society.
Exactly. In a low-trust, high-fear environment, systems built for unity will scale division with terrifying speed. That's the dark edge of infrastructure.
So how did that actually work on the ground?
Imagine a localized riot breaks out in a village in Bihar. A vernacular newspaper prints a highly sensationalized, potentially exaggerated account of the violence.
Okay.
Because of the telegraph network and the railways distributing print media, that terrifying story reaches a city in Punjab, hundreds of miles away, in a matter of hours.
And the people in Punjab have no way to verify the facts.
None. All they know is what the newspaper says, that their religious brethren are being slaughtered.
And because they have zero trust that the state police will protect them, they decide they must form a militia and strike the local minority community preemptively.
If we don't act first, we might not survive. The technology didn't spread truth. It perfectly optimized the spread of contagious panic.
So the state is rapidly losing its monopoly on violence. The system is incredibly brittle.
Yeah, the tension is immense.
But even with all this tension, a society doesn't just spontaneously shatter. It requires an external shock. And this takes us to Section 3, the triggers.
Lighting the fuse.
Exactly. The background stressors are already severe. You have the Bengal famine of 1943,
Where millions died, yeah.
largely due to brutal colonial policies like denying boats and rice to the region to prevent them from falling into Japanese hands. The moral authority of the British Empire is completely bankrupt.
And then the massive system-breaking shock comes directly from London.
Right. Following the end of World War II, Britain is economically devastated.
They have bread rationing in London. They are exhausted.
And they are facing massive pressure from the United States to decolonize.
So a new Labour government, under Clement Attlee, comes to power. And in early 1947, Attlee makes a stunning declaration.
What does he say?
He says, the British will leave India by June 1948.
Which already seems like a dangerously tight timeline to unravel 2 centuries of colonial integration.
It is. But then they send in Lord Mountbatten as the final viceroy, and he accelerates the timeline to a degree that borders on madness.
Yeah, Mountbatten arrives in March 1947. He surveys the political deadlock between Nehru and Jinnah. He sees the localized rioting breaking out, and he makes a unilateral catastrophic calculation.
He decides the British need to cut their losses immediately before a full-scale civil war happens on their watch.
So he suddenly announces that the British will transfer power and partition the country not in June 1948, but on August 15th, 1947.
Right, passing the India Independence Act of 1947.
I really want to isolate this moment because it defies logic. Were they truly so bankrupt that they couldn't afford to manage a proper transition?
Wow.
Like, did they not foresee the logistical impossibility of untangling the military, the civil service, the treasury, and 400 million people in 10 weeks?
They knew it was administratively impossible. But Mountbatten's decision wasn't driven by a sudden lack of resources. It was driven by political optics and administrative negligence.
Their priorities shifted from ensuring a stable transition to rapid extraction of British personnel.
Exactly. They effectively decided to remove the scaffolding from the building while the foundation was visibly cracking, simply so they wouldn't be standing underneath it when it fell.
And the most glaring example of that negligence is the border decision.
Oh, absolutely.
They need to draw the actual lines separating India and Pakistan. This is arguably the most sensitive, complex cartographic task in human history.
They are dividing the provinces of Punjab and Bengal, which are densely populated, deeply integrated regions with rivers, massive irrigation networks, and intertwined communities.
And who do they choose for the job? Cyril Radcliffe.
A brilliant British chancery lawyer who had never, in his entire life, set foot east of Paris.
It's crazy to think about. He had absolutely zero knowledge of Indian culture, geography, or the socioeconomic realities of the land he was about to divide.
It's an act of staggering hubris. They burned to Delhi, and they gave him exactly 5 weeks.
5 weeks to define the borders for hundreds of millions of people.
And look at the mechanics of how he had to work. He was largely isolated in a sweltering bungalow in Delhi, suffering from dysentery.
Right.
He was working with out-of-date census figures from 1941, which were already highly contested.
And he was using maps that didn't accurately show where the villages actually were.
Yeah. The local boundary commissions, made up of Hindu and Muslim judges, were constantly deadlocked, leaving Radcliffe to make arbitrary decisions with a literal stroke of a pen.
He's drawing lines through individual houses, through irrigation canals, through centuries of shared history.
It's just, yeah. He finalized the borders on August 9th. But Mountbatten made the deliberate decision not to publish the Radcliffe line immediately.
He delayed the announcement until August 17th.
2 days after independence.
The absurdity is just sickening. So on August 14th and 15th, millions of people celebrated their independence, raised their new national flags, and had absolutely no idea which country they were actually standing in.
They had no idea.
It's like forcing a team to play Game 7 with no practice, no strategy, and the scoreboard is literally on fire.
That's exactly what it was. And this highlights the difference between long-term pressures, which load the system, and external shocks, which remove stability and time. Fear beat planning, and speed beat stability.
So once that countdown clock hit 0 and the 5-week Radcliffe line was announced, what did the physical collapse of the country actually look like?
When the Radcliffe line was revealed, it triggered a sudden, frantic mass migration of 14 to 15 million people.
Hindus and Sikhs fleeing from the newly created Pakistan into India, and Muslims fleeing from India into Pakistan.
It is the largest, fastest mass migration in human history.
Let's trace how the physical systems fail under that load. Look at the food and resource supply.
Right. The Punjab was the breadbasket of the subcontinent.
The British had built massive canal colonies there, these intricate irrigation systems that turned deserts into farmland. What happens to that system?
The Radcliffe line literally severed the canal systems. The headwaters, the dams controlling the water ended up in India, but the vast majority of the agricultural fields those canals fed ended up in Pakistan.
Overnight, the fundamental infrastructure of agricultural survival was split between two hostile nations.
Millions of farmers abandoned their crops mid-harvest out of terror. The harvest rotted in the fields.
And suddenly, millions of refugees are pouring into new regions that have absolutely no food surplus to feed them.
And the economy, banks, businesses, and trade routes fractured instantly. People lost jobs, property, and financial access overnight.
What about the railways, that massive colonial conveyor belt?
The trains immediately became the primary mechanism for escape. But the system was never designed to move 15 million desperate people simultaneously.
They were unimaginably overcrowded, right?
People were clinging to the roofs, hanging off the sides. And because the social fabric had completely dissolved, these trains, these marvels of colonial engineering, became horrific death traps.
They were ambushed at stations or blocked on the tracks by organized militias.
Yeah, they became known as blood trains, arriving at stations in Lahore or Amritsar, completely silent, filled entirely with the dead.
It's just unfathomable. But this raises the ultimate question about the collapse of the state. Where were the authorities? Where was the police force?
The governance vacuum.
Right. Why couldn't the military step in and secure the railway lines or the cities?
Because the state had literally dissolved itself mid-crisis. The military and the police forces were being partitioned at the exact same time as the country.
Oh, man.
Imagine you are a police officer in Lahore. For 20 years, you've maintained order alongside your fellow officers. But suddenly the border is announced. Lahore is in Pakistan.
Okay, so if you are a Hindu or Sikh officer, you instantly realize you are now an armed minority in a state that is rapidly becoming hostile.
Exactly. You desert your post, you take off your uniform, you take your service weapon, and you run for the border to protect your own family.
And if you are a Muslim officer in India, you do the exact same thing in the opposite direction.
Yep. The monopoly on violence, the core defining feature of a functioning state, completely vanished.
So the police weren't just absent.
No, in many cases, their abandoned weapons fueled the militias, or the remaining highly partisan officers actively participated in the violence against the fleeing minorities.
The rule of law was replaced by the rule of the mob.
And if we connect this to the bigger picture, the most devastating failure was the collapse of the invisible system, public trust.
Right, so we have a perfect cascade failure. Let me break down this loop. A political decision led to a governance gap,
Right.
which caused violence, which triggered migration, that overloaded the infrastructure, collapsing the economy, and finally completely destroyed public trust.
Trust is the invisible architecture of society. The unspoken belief that if you call for help, an authority will answer, and that your neighbor isn't plotting to kill you.
And when that trust evaporated, the collective mindset shifted instantly to, we are entirely on our own,
Exactly.
which transitions us to the human reality on the ground. It's so easy for us to sit here looking back 80 years, tracking cascade failures and policy arrows from a bird's eye view.
But what did this actually feel like for the people waking up in the middle of it?
Between 500,000 and 1 million people were killed, 14 to 15 million displaced. We need to understand the texture of that trauma.
One of the most haunting concepts outlined in the notes is creeping normalcy.
Yeah, because collapse doesn't look like a Hollywood movie where everything explodes at once.
No, collapse rarely announces itself. In the early stages, it just feels like unease. You rely on your past reference points.
Like a family in a village in Punjab might hear about riots in Calcutta and they think, we've had political violence before. It always passes. The leaders in Delhi will figure it out.
Exactly. So even as the political foundation is completely crumbling, everyday life maintains an illusion of normalcy. The local shop still opens. You still invite your neighbor over for tea.
I read accounts of people fleeing their homes and leaving a pot of food simmering on the stove, fully believing they would be back in 3 days once the tension cooled down.
It's the denial based on past reference points. This is just politics. It won't affect us.
Well, why do they wait so long to leave? Looking at the timeline, it seems obvious that disaster is coming. But millions of people stayed until the violence was literally at their front door.
Because the alternative is almost impossible for the human mind to accept. To leave voluntarily means to sever your own roots.
It means abandoning everything.
Right. The land your family has farmed for generations, leaving behind your ancestral home, your business, your wealth, your entire history, and walking into the unknown with only what you can carry on your back.
Human nature dictates that you will construct psychological walls of denial to avoid making that choice. You wait.
But the tragedy of collapse is that as you wait, your options are shrinking exponentially. Collapse doesn't require everyone to understand it. It only requires enough fear and misinformation to shrink people's options before they realize what's happening.
By the time reality pierces through the denial, by the time it is undeniably clear that you must leave or die, the safe routes are already gone. The trains are ambushed. The roads are blocked.
Because word of mouth and fragmented news became deadly. People acted on the worst versions of what they heard because accurate information was too slow. Fear became organized.
And that localized terror wasn't just a spontaneous frenzy of madness. This is a crucial, dark truth of the lived experience.
We talk about militias, but we need to understand how methodical they were.
Yeah, in many cities, the violence was highly organized. Militias used local municipal records, voter registration lists, and property deeds to identify exactly which houses belonged to which minority community.
They systematically went neighborhood by neighborhood. It was the deliberate, weaponized use of bureaucratic information to enact ethnic cleansing.
But amidst that methodical darkness, your notes also highlight an incredible duality in human nature.
Yes, because humans are infinitely complex. Alongside the horrific portrayals, you had breathtaking acts of courage.
You had Muslim families standing in front of their Hindu neighbors' homes, physically blocking the mobs.
You had Sikh villagers escorting Muslim families safely to the border. You had people sharing what little water they had on those death trains with complete strangers.
In the total absence of state morality, individual morality was forced into the light, neighbors hiding and protecting each other while others turned on their friends.
And this gap between what people think is happening and what is actually happening follows a very predictable, tragic timeline.
Which brings us back to the 6 phases of collapse. We've walked through them organically, but let's lay them out.
Sure. Phase 1 is latent strain. This is decades leading up to the early 1940s.
Right.
The illusion of durability.
Then phase 2, escalation and disruption, around 1945 to 1946. Cracks become visible, like Direct Action Day in Calcutta.
Right. Phase 3 is acceleration in early to mid-1947. Decisions speed up, borders are drawn rapidly.
Then phase 4, breaking point, August 1947. Sudden collapse, mass migration, and violence as the borders are revealed.
Phase 5 is cascade failure in late 1947. Systems reinforce failure. Migration leads to resource strain, leading to conflict, leading to more migration.
And finally, phase 6, aftermath and stabilization, running from late 1947 into the 1950s. Reconstruction with scars, carrying generational trauma.
So collapse doesn't feel like a straight line pointing down. It feels like a flat curve that suddenly spikes vertically.
That's exactly it. Looking back at this timeline, was this all inevitable? What are the myths we tell ourselves about how this happened?
Well, we had to deconstruct the myths of the partition and honestly assess the trade-offs. The biggest myth is that it was just religious hatred.
That narrative is intellectually lazy and historically false, isn't it?
Yeah, it removes the accountability from the architects of the collapse. It was about political power, fear, and colonial policy.
And we should dispel the myth that it was inevitable. Human error, the rushed British exit, the lack of transition planning played a massive role. The people of the subcontinent didn't just spontaneously lose their minds in August 1947.
No, their complex society was systematically dismantled, and they were thrown into a terrifying vacuum where their religious identity was made the sole criteria for their survival.
And when we look at the trade-offs, again, trying to remain totally impartial here, as your notes emphasize, without taking sides, what was gained was massive.
Independent nation-states, India as a secular republic, Pakistan as a Muslim homeland, and self-governance.
But what was lost? Over 1 million lives, immense cultural knowledge, and shared spaces.
And the demographic shifts made each country more religiously homogenous.
Which ironically means less everyday exposure to difference.
Right, making it easier to misunderstand and politicize the other.
So what does this all mean for us today? The system didn't just end, it was a forced transformation under pressure.
And even when a system needs to change, like ending colonialism, how it changes determines the cost. Collapse isn't just a failure, it's a transition shaped by rushed decisions.
This brings us to the most personal, fascinating part of the notes you provided, how this massive historical event connects directly to your own reflections on identity.
Unpacking the Mac lens.
Yeah, let's unpack the subpersonality lens, the character of Mac.
So who is Mac? Mac is the connector stuck in a disconnecting world.
He bridges the gap. He's the jock and the nerd. He holds a Black identity but doesn't fit the monolithic mold. He uses humor, but he has vulnerability.
His entire existence says, I'm this, but not just this. He's a layered identity.
Let's trace Mac's evolution and collapse. How would Mac react to partition?
During the early phases, Mac acts as the diffuser. He uses vibes and humor to keep things normal.
Right, but as the acceleration hits, he evolves into the bridge builder, trying to maintain connections across hardening lines.
And then the breaking point hits. The core tension is that partition is the ultimate tragedy of forcing layered people to pick a single box.
The collapsing world says, too bad. Choose anyway. Here's where it gets really interesting and honestly heartbreaking. Mac realizes that vibes and connection alone can't hold society together under extreme pressure.
Humor has to step aside for survival.
Mac becomes the survivor, or the protector. He uses his emotional intelligence to determine who is safe.
And the deeper lesson here is that when the world stops allowing complexity, you adapt. You carry the trauma and the multiple identities anyway.
And finally, he becomes the storyteller and the healer. You become the person who remembers what it felt like before the lines were drawn.
That beautiful, heavy realization perfectly encapsulates why we look at history in the first place.
It really does. So to summarize the journey, we went from a deceptively stable colonial system through the explosive mixture of rapid external shocks and weaponized identity.
Through a heartbreaking six-phase collapse.
A collapse that forced millions to abandon their homes and their complex identities.
It's an intense historical journey.
I want to thank you, the listener, directly for sharing such profound, layered notes that connect geopolitical mechanics to deeply human psychology.
Truly fascinating material.
But I want to leave you with this final provocative thought to mull over. We've talked about how the trauma of this collapse echoed for generations, shaping the new nation-states.
Right.
But consider this, when survivors of a collapse build a new system, they naturally build it to protect against the last trauma they suffered.
Yeah, that makes sense.
If a collapse was caused by fluid identities being forced into rigid boxes, does building a new system strictly around those new rigid borders actually keep you safe?
Or does it permanently institutionalize the very division that tore your world apart in the first place?
Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive.